So, what has science revealed to us? First, the clean animals. The cleaned land animals are described as those that have both a split hoof and one that chews its cud. For the animal to be biblically kosher, it must demonstrate both characteristics. What animals do we see that have both a split hoof and chews its cud? Cattle, sheep, deer, elk, moose, bison, antelope. All of these animals are ruminating herbivores, which means they consume only grasses and other vegetable matter. They're not predators. They don't consume any kind of flesh. They eat nothing that is dead or rotting. In every case, these animals each has a very complex digestive system, which allows them to purify their food multiple times before the nutrients enter the bloodstream and ultimately their flesh. The birds we're given permission to eat are chicken, duck, pheasants, turkeys. All are non carrion birds. We'll talk more about carrion birds later. The fish we're allowed to eat have to have both fins and scales. What kind of fish contain both fins and scales? Salmon, trout, steelhead, tuna, anchovies, herring, sardines, mackerel. These fish are not only healthy for us to eat, they're also high in beneficial omega 3 fatty acids. And we are permitted to eat grasshoppers and crickets called locusts. Interestingly enough, grasshoppers have as many grams of protein as beef, with half the fat content. Locusts eat only vegetable matter. Most every other bug will eat things that are rotting, decaying. I don't need to tell you what a dung beetle eats. Locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers eat only crops and vegetation, much like cattle. Matthew 3 1 through 4 states, in those days came Yachanan, the immerser, or John the Baptist, preaching in the wilderness of Judea, and saying, repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. For this is he that was spoken of by the prophet Eliyahu, saying, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of Yahweh, and make straight his paths. And the same Yachanan had his raiment of camel's hair, and a leathern girdle about his loins, and his meat was locusts and wild honey. That's Matthew 3 1 through 4. This makes much more sense now, doesn't it? Why wasn't John eating spiders and wild honey, or scorpions and wild honey, bats and wild honey, or snakes and wild honey? John was the son of Zechariah, the Levite, and a priest. John was a prophet who knew the Torah and would never eat anything unclean. The good news is that you don't have to go out and catch them yourself. There is now a delicious cereal on the market. I once heard Dr. J. Vernon McGee, who I believe was a good and kind Christian man, say that John didn't eat locusts per se, that he ate, quote, locust beans. Christians seem to have a hard time getting their Western minds around the idea of eating grasshoppers. So they teach that John ate locust beans and other such folly. I can't help but wonder if this isn't an attempt by Christians to downplay John's Torah obedience. Aside from the fact that this cannot be established by anything in Scripture, we have documented historical evidence that John did indeed eat locusts. First, because the Greek word used in Matthew 3:4 and again in Mark 1:6 for the locust that John ate is Strong's 200. It's akros. Thayer's lexicon reads akros, a locust, particularly that species which especially infests Oriental countries, stripping fields and trees. Numberless swarms of them almost every spring are carried by the wind from Arabia into Palestine, and having devastated that country, migrate to regions further north until they perish by falling into the sea. The Orientals are accustomed to feed upon locusts, either raw or roasted and seasoned with salt, or prepared in other ways. And the Israelites also, according to Leviticus 11:22, were permitted to eat them. This is from Thayer's lexicon. Let's take a look at two more passages where we find this word acris. And from the smoke, locusts, or acris, went out over the earth, and power was given to them which the scorpions of the earth have. Revelation 9:3. Beware stinging beans, and the form of locusts, acris, was like the form of horses prepared for battle, and upon their heads as crowns of the likeness of gold, and their faces were like the faces of men. Revelation 9:7. The word for the locust that John ate is the same word used in Revelation for the locusts that plague the earth in the time of Yahweh's wrath. Clearly, these cannot be locust beans. Now, let's take a look at the use of the Greek word acris as it was used by translators of the Septuagint. Again, for those that don't know, the Septuagint is the Greek version of the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, which was completed in the late 2nd century BCE. We find this word acris many places in the Septuagint, but one you're probably familiar with is Exodus 10:4. Let's take a look. But if you refuse to let my people go, then tomorrow I will bring locusts into your territory. Now let's take a look at the Hebrew word for locusts, and we'll look at the word for locust bean as well. The Hebrew word we translate as locust here in Exodus 10:4 is the word arbeh, Strong's 697. It's an aleph, a resh, a beit, and a he. Quote unquote locust beans are in actuality carob beans. We'll look at the Hebrew word for carob in a moment, but it's important to understand that the word locust beans is actually an English term that has no connection with the Hebrew word for a carob bean. The carob bean in Hebrew is actually called karuv. It's a chet, a resh, a wav, and a bet. But interestingly, this shows up no place in the Bible. This is a problem for the Christian teacher that is trying to make the case that the carob bean was such a staple in Israel. Notice how close the Hebrew word karuv resembles our English word carob. There's a reason for that. The etymology of the word is from the sword-shaped pod, or charev, which is the word sword in Hebrew. The word charev, or sword in Hebrew, passed from Hebrew to Aramaic and from Aramaic to Arabic. Harubah is the word for sword in Arabic. In the Middle Ages, it passed from Arabic to European languages, charub in French, charubah in Italian, and cherub or carob in English. At any rate, you can clearly see that the Hebrew word for carob and the word for locust are in no way related and do not look remotely similar. Locust, again, in Hebrew, is the word arbeh, Strong 679. It's an aleph, a resh, a beit, and a he. Carob, on the other hand, is charuv in Hebrew. There's no Strong's reference for this since it's not in Scripture. And unlike arbeh, or locust, it's spelled with a chet, a resh, a wav, and a bet. Totally unrelated words. Lastly, the Aramaic Peshitta text of the New Testament also says that John ate locusts, the bug, not the bean. And for one last witness, let's take a look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. But before we do, let's set the stage. John and the Essenes. A careful reading of the Gospels will show that Yochanan, or John the Baptist, had his own disciples, as we see in John 1:35, who continued on as such, apart from the Yeshua movement, even after both John and Yeshua had died, as we see in Acts 19:1-3. The flavor of John chapter 1 also indicates that John did not live alone in the wilderness, but lived with a community of followers near Bethbarah, John 1:28. A town just 8 miles from Qumran. Qumran is an ancient community of biblical purists that lived separate from the Pharisaical religious system in the first century. It is believed that it is the Essenes of Qumran that were responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the most important similarities between John the Baptist and his disciples and the local Qumran community is quite obviously that of geography. As mentioned, John and his disciples resided, quote, in the wilderness, near a town just 8 miles from Qumran. In fact, the caves in which the scrolls were found are just 5 miles from the location along the Jordan at which John was baptizing. Both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament use the phrase in the wilderness, drawn from Isaiah 4:3, almost as a proper noun to describe this area. One New Testament passage in particular seemed a mystery up until the discovery of the scrolls. In Luke 180, we read, "The child, John the Baptist, grew and became strong in the Spirit, and was in the wilderness till the day of his manifestation to Israel." What would the child be doing in the wilderness? Could John have been raised at the Qumran community? It makes sense that Elizabeth would have taken John away to the wilderness community due to the events surrounding his conception and his birth. Consider for a moment that Elizabeth's pregnancy would have been considered a great miracle by many in the region. Furthermore, when John was named and circumcised, at that moment his father Zachariah's speech returned. This was considered a great miracle in all of Judea, so much so that the people proclaimed in Luke 166, "What indeed will this boy be?" And the hand of Yahweh was with him. The point is that it wasn't the child Yeshua, born in obscurity, that would have been considered the likely candidate to be the coming Messiah. It was John, the son of a priest, that would have gotten a lot of attention. This is confirmed in Luke 3:15. But as the people had been thinking about John, and they were all pondering in their hearts whether he were the Messiah. Again, that's John 3:15. The circumstances surrounding John's conception and his birth and the miracle that occurred at his bris would have been a real problem for Herod. Elizabeth was already well advanced in years when John was born, so he would have most likely been raised by the Qumran community in the wilderness. Remember, when Herod ordered the murder of all male children under the age of 2, as we see in Matthew 2:16, this would have put John in danger as well. An apocryphal tradition once circulated in the Church of the East may offer some insight. The Proto-Evangelion of James, once read in some Eastern churches, records a tradition that, at the time of the slaughter of innocents, quote, "Elizabeth took her son and went up into the mountains and looked around for a place to hide him, and there was no secret place to be found. Then she groaned within herself and said, O mountain of Yahweh, receive the mother with the child. For Elizabeth could not climb up, and instantly the mountain was divided and received them. And there appeared to them an angel or messenger of Yahweh to preserve them." Again, this is the Proto-Evangelion 16:3-8. Could this reading be preserving an ancient tradition that John and his mother were taken in through an opening in the mountains or a cave, and a messenger of Yahweh at Qumran took them in? This possibility is strengthened by the fact that Hugh Schoenfeld has shown that there were a number of parallelisms between the Deuterocanon Hebrew Matthew and the Proto-Evangelion, which, quote, "cannot be accidental," according to Schoenfeld. Papias of Hierapolis, who was born before the fall of the Second Temple in 70 AD, writes, "Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language, and everyone interpreted them as he was able." Moreover, Josephus tells us that the Essenes commonly raised other people's children, as we see in Josephus' Wars 2:8-3. Thus it would seem that John the Baptist was indeed raised up in the Qumran community. As a Levite and a descendant of Zadok, John would have held a prominent place in the Qumran community, which favored the priesthood heirs over the Pharisaical religious system. However, John's normal life at Qumran was interrupted when, quote, the word of Elohim came to John in the wilderness, as we see in Luke 3:2. In a rigid community where everyone had a rank and no one spoke out of turn, John's message may not have been welcome. This would explain why John and his disciples relocated to nearby Bethbara. As we discussed, both Matthew and Mark tell us that John ate locusts, not locust beans or locust bean gum, as we see in Matthew 3:4 and Mark 1:6. This is further confirmed by the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, also known as the Qumran Caves Scrolls, are a collection of some 981 different texts discovered between 1946 and 1956 in 11 caves from the immediate vicinity of the ancient settlement of Khirbet Qumran in the West Bank. The caves are located about 2 kilometers inland from the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, from which they derive their name. The scrolls were located in various caves located just 8 miles from Bethbara. The texts are of great historical, religious, and linguistic significance because they include the second oldest known surviving manuscripts of works later included in the Hebrew Bible canon, as well as extra biblical documents regarding daily life of the Essenes. Two such scrolls are the Temple Scroll and the Damascus document, also called the Zadokite Fragment. The Temple Scroll contains verbiage regarding the dietary restrictions that the Essene community kept. It's almost identical to the commandments given in Leviticus 11, including the fact that locusts were biblically kosher. The Damascus document, aka the Zadokite Fragment, attests to the practice of eating roasted or boiled locusts or grasshoppers at Qumran. Unlike a, quote, locust bean, real locusts would have provided John with all of his protein needs. As a Torah observant Hebrew, a Levite nonetheless, John ate only according to what Yahweh instructed in Leviticus 11. This would have included the only kosher insect mentioned in the Torah, locusts. So you can clearly see that John indeed ate locusts, not locust beans or carob beans. There is no such word in Hebrew or Greek as a locust bean, and there's absolutely no evidence, scriptural or secular, that John ate anything other than real locusts, which are grasshoppers or crickets. I understand that perhaps Mr. McGee did not have access to the Qumran scrolls, and perhaps he was not well versed in the Greek Septuagint. But what I don't understand is that he most certainly would have been able to see that the Greek word akris, which is the word translated as locust in Matthew 3:4 and Mark 1:6, is the very same word used for the locusts in Revelation 9:3 and 9:7. This would not have required more than a few minutes research. And while I do believe that Mr. McGee was a sincere man, it's important to give people answers based on scripture that can be proven to be true instead of speculation and opinion that lacks any support whatsoever. The point is, if Christian leaders and teachers are wrong about something as easy to search out as this, what else are they wrong about? I do believe their anti-Torah bent causes many Christians to obscure things that might conflict with cherished doctrines. The Messiah rebuked the Pharisees for setting aside Yahweh's Torah and elevating their own doctrines and traditions. But that rebuke can be just as fairly pointed at churchmen who do the same thing. If we don't stand upon the foundation of truth, we have nothing. Okay, moving on, a little bit more about locusts. Something else to consider. When Yahweh sent the plague of locusts on Egypt, as we see in Exodus 10:3-6, he also showed the Egyptians compassion. How? Yes, we do know that the locusts did eat all the fruit and all the crops, because of course they eat only vegetation. But he didn't leave them without an abundant, high-protein, biblically kosher food source. Even in judgment, Yahweh is merciful. So far, the science or knowledge that we've provided has simply been what we should have been able to ascertain by believing what his word says and looking at the creatures that he's designated as clean and unclean. Using critical thinking and a little common sense, we should have been able to understand why he made such distinctions. I mean, really, an oyster, have you ever really looked at an oyster? Be honest. Does it really look like something we should be eating? It looks like something people cough up when they're sick. We'll talk more about this grotesque little creature in a while. Now, to our science, the empirical science behind the dietary restrictions. What does secular science tell us about the animals Yahweh declares clean or unclean? In 1953, Dr. David Macht, MD, of Johns Hopkins University, an award-winning experimental biologist whose methods of assessing pharmacological toxicity are still used today, published research findings from a study he conducted at Johns Hopkins entitled An Experimental Pharmacological Appreciation of Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. In it, he tested the effect on the root growth of seedlings, Lupinus albus, grown in plant, physiological solutions containing the necessary salts and ions for their growth, with and without the addition of muscle juice of clean and unclean animals. A phytotoxic index based on the ratio of the comparison of the range of root growth of the muscle juice solution of the clean and unclean animals to that of the control saline solution was used to determine the toxicity of protein sources. It was found that solutions prepared from clean animals, fish, and birds, as described in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, were practically non-toxic, while the solutions from unclean muscle extracts were considered toxic. A total of 21 animals, 14 birds, and 51 fish specimens were used. His experiment corroborated the biblical position that those animals, birds, and fish listed as unclean were not healthy for human consumption. So, in summary, Dr. Mach conducted an experiment where he watered plants with broth. The control group he watered with saline. He also watered a second group with a broth made from meat of clean animals, and a third group he watered with the broth of unclean animals. His findings confirmed the truth of Leviticus 11 in that the plants suffered no toxicity from the broth of clean animals, whereas the plants that were watered with the broth of unclean animals suffered toxicity. Perhaps that is why the scriptures not only prohibit the eating of unclean animals, but also the consumption of broth from them as well. As we see in Isaiah 65, 3 through 5, a people who provoke me with anger continually to my face, who sacrifice in gardens and burn incense on altars of brick, who sit among the graves and spend the night in the tombs, who eat swine's flesh and the broth of abominable things in their vessels, who say, keep yourself, do not come near me, for I am holier than you. These are smoke in my nostrils, a fire that burns all day. Isaiah 65, 3 through 5. Is everything in the sea for food? First, let's consider the unclean sea creatures that so many love to dine on. The scientific community calls them filter feeders. Filter feeders, also known as suspension feeders, are animals that feed by straining suspended matter or toxins and waste particles from the water, typically by passing the water over specialized filtering structures. Some animals that use this method of feeding are clams, oysters, krill, sponges, some fish, and sharks. Filter feeders can play an important role in clarifying or cleaning the water. There are four syndromes called shellfish poisoning, which share some common features and are primarily associated with bivalve mollusks, such as mussels, clams, oysters, and scallops. These shellfish are filter feeders, and therefore accumulate toxins produced by microscopic algae such as dinoflagellates, diatoms, and cyanobacteria. The symptoms are paralytic shellfish poisoning or PSP, neurotoxic shellfish poisoning or NSP, diarrheal shellfish poisoning or DSP, and amnesic shellfish poisoning or ASP. La cucaracha de mar, the cockroach of the sea. Most people don't know it, but crustaceans are actually gigantic bacteria-eating cockroaches of lakes and of the sea. This is what the word crustacean really means. Both shrimp and cockroaches are scavenging arthropods. Now let's hear from Jim Gaffigan on the subject.
All of New England, you guys love your seafood, and it's just disgusting. Lobster! Lobster! At this seafood restaurant, right? And this guy came over to our table. It wasn't even our waiter. He came over to the table. He was like, hey, I couldn't have... I don't know how to do the Boston accent. You're not eating lobster. Is there a reason why you're not eating lobster? And I was like, I thought I'd order what I want. I wasn't really in the mood for bug meat. Because that's what shellfish are. They're just creepy, crawly, giant insects on the bottom of the ocean. You know, fish are swimming around like, we gotta get an exterminator up in this piece. They're bugs! They have a shell like a bug. They have spindly legs and crawl around like a bug. They have antennae like a monster. They're probably monsters. Like, if you went home and you saw a chicken in your house, you'd be like, what the hell is a chicken doing in my house? But if you saw a lobster, you'd be like, we're moving. Because there's not a nickel's worth of difference between a lobster and a giant scorpion. Now, I understand everyone loves lobster. I love lobster. Hey, I like butter too, okay? How can I eat 3 sticks of butter? Well, I found this giant swimming sea scorpion. It's just a spoonful of butter helps the bug meat go down. In the most delightful way. Lobster tail. Is that the area near the butt? That's what I want, a little turf and bug butt. How about those restaurants where you have to pick out your own lobster? You're like, I guess I'll take that one that's really struggling with the rubber bands. He seems appealing. Why don't we boil him to death?
If a sea creature has no fins or scales and possesses a shell, it is an aquatic arthropod belonging to the family of crustaceans. A crustacean is any of a class of chiefly aquatic arthropods, including lobsters, crabs, and shrimp, having segmented bodies with a hard shell. If you leave matters to the Muslims and their so-called Holy Quran, they'll have you believing that all seafood is divinely ordained. According to the Quran 596, lawful to you is the game of the sea and its food, a provision for you and for the travelers. As you can see, Islamic dietary restrictions are not exactly the same as Yahweh's instructions, and it doesn't end with seafood. Yes, swine's flesh is forbidden in both the Torah and the Quran. However, camels, which are biblically verboten, they have no split hoof, they are considered halal in Islam. Camel hump is actually a Muslim delicacy. Camels are unhealthy as they are a host to a wide variety of parasites. I had to laugh. I was researching the more than 200 diseases and 19 worms that are present in the flesh of a swine when I stumbled across an internet article titled, Science Leads to Islam. A few problems with this. First, the Torah was given to Moshe, or Moses, more than 3,500 years ago, whereas the Quran was written in the 6th century, late 6th century CE. Clearly, Yahweh's dietary restrictions predate Islam by more than 2,000 years. Something else that's rather humorous was that someone cited a verse in the Quran that shows that Islam understood that the earth was round long before it was acknowledged by science. Unfortunately for the Muslim, Isaiah revealed this truth to us around 740 BCE, some 1400 years before Muhammad was even born. Isaiah 40, verse 22. It is he who sits above the circle or chug of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. First, the word we translate as a circle is the Hebrew word chug. It's a chet, a wav, and a gimel, which is not a flat circle but actually a sphere according to the Hebrew Chaldee lexicon. Furthermore, as you can see, Isaiah tells us that Yahweh, quote, stretches out the heavens. The ancient Greeks taught that space was never ending, and this belief continued until the early 1900s. In 1929, Hubble found proof that the universe is indeed expanding. Thank you, Prophet Isaiah. The oldest book in the Bible is the book of Job. We don't know exactly how old it is, but we know that it predates the Torah. Therefore, the book of Job has to be more than 3,500 years old. Job 26:7. He stretches out the north over the empty space and hangs the earth upon nothing. What makes Job's statement so amazing is that cultures across the globe have believed that the earth is held up by various creatures. Originally, the Buddhists and the Hindus believed the earth was a flat plate and was held up by elephants and turtles. The ancient Greeks believed the earth was held up by Atlas, the Titan. But thousands of years before these cultures even existed, Job told us what science has confirmed. The earth hangs on nothing. Thank you, Job. The truth is that a lot of what Islam teaches was ripped right from the pages of the Tanakh, which predates the Quran by literally thousands of years. And speaking of Islamic halal, did you know that it is considered a sin in Islam to consume any animal that was not slaughtered in accordance with halal law? Yes, this includes animals that Yahweh has declared clean. Even lamb is not to be eaten if it was not slaughtered according to Islamic halal. But why not? Because to slaughter in accordance with halal is to sacrifice to the Muslim God, which is a false God. Any God that is not Yahweh, the Elohim of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, is by definition an idol, according to Torah. And what does Scripture tell us about eating things offered to idols? Well, we could include the myriad of Torah passages that forbid both sacrificing and eating things offered to idols, but I'm not going to. No, I'm going to share the opinion of Peter, James, and Paul on the matter. After meeting to discuss the issue of those coming out from among the heathen or Gentiles, James speaks up and says, wherefore my sentence is, that we trouble not them which out from among the Gentiles are turned to Elohim, but we write unto them that they abstain from things sacrificed to idols, and from fornication, and from things strangled, and from blood. For Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day. That's Acts 15:21. Notice first that these non-Jews are leaving or coming out from among the Gentiles. The Greek word we translate from here is the word apo. It's Strong's 575. Strong adds a note to this word that it usually denotes separation, departure, or cessation. So we now have former Gentiles joining this already established Hebrew faith. As we see in Acts 14:27, when we read, and when the whole ecclesia, not church, had gathered together, they were relating everything that Elohim had done with them, and that he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. And in Acts 15:19 through 21, we read James gives them 4 specific Torah commandments to follow. Again, they are fornication, strangled things, blood, and things offered to idols. And again, these 4 directives are specific Torah commandments. These are also pagan worship practices that must stop in order for what? for those coming out from among the Gentiles to be welcome into the synagogue to learn the rest of the Torah, which is taught every Sabbath. How do I know that this is the reason? Because I read the next verse. 15 verse 21 reads, "For Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogue every Sabbath day." Moses is another way of saying Torah. James commands that those coming out from among the Gentiles keep these four commandments in order that they would be welcome to attend the synagogue and to learn the rest of the Torah every Sabbath day. These were not the quote only commandments given to Gentiles or the only commandments Gentiles are expected to keep as taught by the church. How do I know that? Because these four don't include murder, theft, stealing, or lying. These four commandments were simply the bare minimum in order for them to have fellowship in the synagogue so that they may learn the Torah, i.e., Moses, every Sabbath day. But I want to address the issue of things offered to idols. Meat that has been slaughtered according to halal is indeed meat that has been sacrificed or offered to an idol. According to Acts 15, it's off the table. Yes, even for those who believe in Jesus. But when would this ever be an issue for a Christian? Well, the answer is anytime you buy lamb sold at Costco, it's actually halal lamb. Okay, enough about Islam. The Quran and halal, it doesn't matter that the Quran permits the eating of cockroach of the sea. We don't look to anyone but Yahweh and his Torah for instruction, right? So now you understand that when you eat crustaceans, lobster, crawfish, crabs, shrimp, or even scallops, mussels, and a clam, you're eating an ocean or lake scavenger. Shrimp are vermin, and they are the biological cousin to the cockroach. You might as well get a handful of big cockroaches and throw them into a boiling pot of hot water and boil them till their back pops open and you can pour melted butter over them and eat them the same way you do a lobster, a crab, and a shrimp. It's the same thing. Shrimp and cockroaches are biological cousins. The only difference is that one cleans the ocean, the other cleans the land. But both are scavengers and both are bacteria-laden vermin. Shrimp is a nasty scavenger and thus it's biblically verboten. It's forbidden. Shrimp thrives off eating the flesh of dead, rotting creatures and toxins on the sea floor. Throw a dead, rotting dog in the part of the water where shrimp dwell and watch what the shrimp, along with lobster and crab, will do to the flesh of the dead, rotting dog. Do you know what they call crawdads or crawfish in the South? They call them mud bugs. Google the word mud bugs and see what you find. Like the shrimp, the crawdad is a vermin and a sea cockroach, just like its land cousin. I remember as a kid we would go down and play in the local drainage creek. It was absolutely filthy, but the crawfish, or small lobsters, thrived in it. Meet Dr. Axe. Dr. Axe is a well-known and respected physician and clinical nutritionist. He has been a guest on the Dr. Oz show as well as NBC and Fox and hosts a regular program on CBS Nashville. Dr. Axe has been a physician for many professional athletes. In 2009, he began working with the Wellness Advisory Council and professional swim teams. He worked with professional swimmers, including Michael Phelps and Ryan Lochte, providing nutritional advice and musculoskeletal work on athletes to increase their performance. He also traveled to the 2012 Games in London to work with the USA athletes. Dr. Axe is also a Christian man. Dr. Axe has worked with several Christian organizations, such as Mercy Ministries, Lifeway, and other large churches and corporations. Of shrimp, Dr. Axe says, quote, 90% of shrimp are farm raised. According to the report from Food and Water Watch, 90% of the shrimp we eat has been imported, but less than 2% of that gets inspected by U.S. regulatory agencies. But what's the big deal? Imported shrimp, more than any other seafood, has been found to be contaminated with banned chemicals and pesticides, and it skirts food safety authorities only to wind up on your plate. The number one reason for all that? The dirty conditions in which farm raised shrimp are raised. Dr. Axe continues, in China, where the majority of shrimp come from, there are millions of shrimp packed together in ponds where diseases run rampant. In addition to antibiotics, shrimp farmers use large quantities of chemicals like pesticides and herbicides in their ponds, which are cancer-causing substances. The most common chemicals found in fish and shrimp farms include organophosphates, contain carbaryl, and have been linked to memory loss, headaches, and are toxic to the nervous system. A study published at the Mount Sinai Journal of Medicine found that this chemical can be linked to toxicity in pregnant women. Malachite green is an antifungal used on shrimp eggs that has been linked to cancerous tumors in studies on mice. This is a key point because the farm-raised seafood has been shown as containing significantly elevated rates of chemicals and contaminants detrimental to human health. Dr. Axe continues, shrimp farms and packing are disgusting. According to the Rodale Report, a report published in the November 2012 issue of Bloomberg magazine revealed some truly disgusting facts about the conditions in which shrimp are packaged and shipped. At one particular facility in Vietnam, the magazine's reporters found processing plant floors littered with garbage, flies buzzing around, and shrimp that wasn't being stored at proper temperatures. The shrimp itself was packed in ice made from local tap water, which public health authorities warned should be boiled before using due to microbial contamination potentially exposing the shrimp and eaters to more bacterial contamination. According to Bloomberg, FDA inspectors have rejected 1,380 loads of seafood from Vietnam since 2007 for filth, salmonella, including 81 from the plant that reporters visited. Keep in mind that when Bloomberg reports that FDA inspectors rejected 1,380 loads of contaminated shrimp since 2007, that 90% of U.S. shrimp is imported and less than 2% is ever inspected. Dr. Axe continues, imported shrimp contain antibiotic drugs. Most of the shrimp that Americans eat originated from places without restrictions on illegal contaminants such as dioxins, PCBs, and other banned chemicals. In an effort to destroy the pathogenic bacteria that plague shrimp farms, they're given daily doses of antibiotics. The most common antibiotics given include oxytetracycline and ciprofloxacin, both of which are used to treat human infections and can increase the risk of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. In a 2003 study in Thailand, they found that 74% of shrimp contain antibiotic residue, and in 2007, the FDA found that 25% of shrimp samples to contain other illegal medications in the shrimp. Ready-to-eat shrimp actually contains up to 162 separate varieties of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Shrimp contain xenoestrogens. One of the preservatives used for shrimp is 4-hexylresocinol, which is used to prevent discoloration in shrimp. It was found by International Program on Chemical Safety to be a xenoestrogen, a harmful chemical, which has been shown to increase the risk of developing breast cancer in women and reducing sperm counts in men. Another aspect to note is that shrimp are one of the most cholesterol-rich foods in the world. 4 to 5 shrimp contains more than 150 milligrams of cholesterol, which is 50% of your daily recommended allowance. The fact is that shrimp, crawfish, crabs, lobster are all very high in cholesterol. Dr. Axe concludes his article by answering the question, but is wild shrimp good for you? He responds by saying, to be quite frank, I don't think healthy shrimp exists. Even if you can somehow harvest them naturally in a wild-caught environment free of toxins, I still wouldn't consume them because they are naturally bottom feeders. Again, Dr. Axe is a doctor, a scientist, and a Christian man. Dr. Bick Shane PhD, is a writer, consultant, and practitioner in the field of clinical nutrition, specializing in food science research and whole food nutrition. Dr. Shane earned his undergraduate degree at the University of Florida in 1978, holds a doctorate degree from Westbrook University and from the University of Natural Medicine, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Dr. Shane corroborates Dr. Axe's findings in regards to shrimp. Dr. Shane states, quote, 90% of all shrimp comes from Asia and is raised in toxic sewage pond environment. The water is so contaminated and diseased that farmers use outrageous amounts of antibiotics. So when you eat shrimp, you're not only eating the sewage, but you're also consuming drugs, many of which are illegal in the Western world. Dipped in cocktail sauce or fried on the barbie, shrimp is a dangerous food. I agree with everything Dr. Shane just said, except the last sentence, because shrimp is simply not food, according to the creator of the universe. And again, let's read Dr. Axe's closing comments. To be quite frank, I don't think healthy shrimp exists. Even if you can somehow harvest them naturally in a wild caught environment free of toxins, I still wouldn't consume them because they are naturally bottom feeders. There you have it. Dr. Axe wouldn't consume even wild shrimp because of what they are designed to do. Interestingly, in April of 2010, BP caused a catastrophic oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Shrimp fishermen in the Gulf were outraged, saying that BP has destroyed their livelihood. But just a year later, something interesting happened. In April of 2011, it was reported that giant shrimp were invading the Gulf. And on April 26, 2012, CNN reported that giant cannibal shrimp invasion growing. CNN reports an invasion of giant shrimp into America's coastal waters appears to be getting worse. Researchers from the U.S. Geological Survey and the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration reported Thursday that sightings of massive tiger shrimp were 10 times higher in 2011 than in 2010. And they're probably even more prevalent than reports suggest because the more fishermen and other locals become accustomed to seeing them, the less likely they are to report them, said Pam Fuller, a USGS biologist. The shrimp, which can grow up to 13 inches long, are native to Asian and Australian waters and have been reported in coastal waters from North Carolina to Texas. Quote, they're supposed to be very good, but they can get very large, sort of like lobsters, Fuller said. In 1998, about 2,000 of the creatures were accidentally released from an aquaculture facility in South Carolina. 300 of those were recovered from the waters off South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida within 3 months. Farming of the giant shrimp ended in the United States, but they were caught again off Alabama, North Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. This turned out to be a quote happy accident for the Gulf shrimping industry. Now, a few observations in regards to this story. First, notice the massive size of these shrimp. This is a shrimp, folks, not a lobster. Also, notice that we have known that this particular species has lived in the Gulf since at least 1998, perhaps earlier. But pay particular attention to the statement that the population of this giant shrimp exploded, quote, 10 times higher in 2011 than in 2012. What happened to cause such a dramatic rise in the population of this giant shrimp? How did they get so massive? Yep, the BP oil spill. Consider for a moment that crude oil is nothing more than decay or death. Crude oil is fossil fuel, meaning that it is produced naturally from decaying plants and animals. By the time the spill had been contained, there was an estimated 210 million US gallons of shrimp food, crude oil, released into the Gulf of Mexico, and the shrimp party began. Notice the crab thriving at the BP deepwater site as caught by the camera. He's eating something dead, something that is soaked in oil that BP spilled. And this crab is loving it. Funny story, I was watching Finding Nemo one night. Yes, I'm a grown man and I still love Disney movies. While watching the film, something struck my wife and I as both funny and true. If you haven't seen the movie, you really should. But there's a scene where all of the fish in the tank get together and intentionally cause the filter to fail, which results in a very disgusting bacteria laden dirty tank. They want the tank dirty so the owner will be forced to clean it, giving them an opportunity to escape. Now see this picture of Jacques, the shrimp, with what is essentially a quote poop beard. The leader fish yells at Jacques, the shrimp, and says, "Jacques, I said no cleaning." To which Jacques turns and looks with his poop beard and replies, "I am ashamed." Poor Jacques is just doing what he was created to do, eat poop. As we've discussed, shrimp, crab, lobster, crawfish, clams, mussels, and oysters eat feces. They eat garbage and they eat other bacteria. They act as filters of our oceans, of our lakes, and our streams. Hence, they are all designated by the scientific community as filter feeders, which is why they're unclean and unhealthy and can be dangerous to eat. Shellfish harbor high levels of arsenic. From the Associated Press, China bans shellfish from U.S. West Coast for arsenic and toxin levels. December 16, 2013. China has suspended imports of shellfish from the U.S. West Coast, cutting off one of the biggest export markets for the Northwest companies. The Chinese government imposed the ban after discovering that recent shipments of geoduck clams from Northwest waters had high levels of arsenic and a toxin that causes paralytic shellfish poisoning. The Chinese government says the ban that started last week will continue indefinitely. Clams, oysters, and all other two-shelled bivalves harvested off of Washington, Oregon, Alaska, and Northern California are affected. The fact is, all shellfish carry arsenic in their flesh, regardless of where they're caught. Death on the half shell. From the documents library at the Center for Science in the Public Interest, consumers put faith in the government to assure the safety of the food supply, but this report will document how the government has betrayed that trust by allowing a well-known food hazard to sicken and kill consumers year after year. Virtually all shellfish harvested from the Gulf of Mexico in warmer months carry Vibrio vulnificus bacteria. Public health officials estimate that Vibrio vulnificus in shellfish causes around 50 to 60 serious illnesses each year. Half of the people who develop a blood infection from this hazard die from it, making this one of the deadliest types of food poisoning. If you don't know, Vibrio vulnificus is also known as flesh-eating bacteria, and it's carried by shellfish. Returning to the study from the Center for Science and the Public Interest, public health officials and the shellfish industry have known about this hazard for over a decade, but have not implemented any effective measures to prevent it. That is because the Food and Drug Administration's feeble food safety program has given away much of its authority to control shellfish to a group called the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference. The ISSC is a coalition of shellfish producing states and industry representatives that set state standards for the shellfish industry. The conference, which is designated to facilitate the interstate sale of raw shellfish, such as oysters, clams, and mussels, lets the shellfish industry play a leading role in setting the policies governing its industry, while excluding customers and their representatives from meaningful participation in the process. The FDA has allowed the conference to assume responsibility for setting standards governing hazards in shellfish products. Today, the same Gulf Coast shellfish industry that has been linked to nearly 150 deaths and hundreds of illnesses over the past 12 years uses the ISSC to prevent urgently needed public health protections. This report documents the history of the FDA's and the ISSC's failure to adequately address the public health hazard posed by these toxins in shellfish. The story of Vibrio vulnificus is the story of the fox guarding the henhouse. Quite simply, the shellfish industry and its home state regulators, which dominate the ISSC, have proven that they cannot police themselves. For its part, the FDA has stayed on the sidelines, seemingly fearful of the $40 million Gulf Coast shellfish industry and its powerful allies on Capitol Hill. Effective government action could have prevented many Vibrio vulnificus-related deaths and illnesses over the past decade, and is still needed to prevent countless tragedies in years to come. The FDA plays politics with public health. Vibrio vulnificus is a bacteria that naturally occurs in warm salt waters where some molluscan shellfish are harvested, and is one of the most severe foodborne infectious diseases. It can induce primary septicemia, a blood infection that leads to the death of nearly half of all of the cases. Those who survive a case of primary septicemia often face amputations and chronic pain. Some people are particularly vulnerable to these blood infections due to underlying medical conditions. The bacterium may be present in all types of shellfish, including oysters, clams, and crabs, and cannot be detected by sight, smell, or taste. Rather than acting as a guardian of public health, the FDA has, in effect, abdicated its statutory authority to regulate shellfish to the industry-dominated ISSC, and the ISSC has consistently failed to place the health of consumers ahead of the financial interests of the shellfish industry. As a result, each year Americans die or become debilitated from these infections. From the South Texas Record, November 30th, 2012, by David Yates, the estate of Carl Ray Lovett has filed a wrongful death suit against Floyd's Cajun Seafood and Texas Steakhouse, alleging that the man died after eating contaminated oysters. The suit, filed November 27th in Jefferson County District Court, alleges the warning about eating raw seafood was insufficient and not placed near the seafood items on the menu. According to the lawsuit, on May 11th, Lovett and his family went to Floyd's in Beaumont for a Mother's Day celebration. The suit alleges that Lovett was reassured that the oysters were safe to eat, so he ordered a dozen raw oysters on the half shell and ate all of them. The following day, he began experiencing nausea and aches in his lower extremities. On the night of May 15th, his right leg swelled, blistered, and turned dark, prompting him to see a physician in the morning. He died that afternoon from Vibrio vulnificus sepsis flesh-eating bacteria, a bacteria known in untreated contaminated oysters. The suit further claims that the warnings about raw seafood on Floyd's menu are on the back of the menu, away from the oyster section, and under the children's menu, with writing so small that it's difficult for middle-aged people like Lovett to read without magnifying glass. The warning also does not warn of death, the suit states. Floyd's is accused of gross negligence and deceptive trade practices, entitling the plaintiffs to exemplary damages. The reason I emphasize the warning also does not warn of death is because we already have seen several warnings in Scripture. Deuteronomy 30, verse 19, I call heaven and earth as a witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curse. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live. Deuteronomy 10:13, keep Yahweh's commands and statutes I am giving you today for your good. Yahweh warns us that to disobey equals death, and tells us that his commandments are for our good. If we refuse to believe and obey, then, quote, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, certainly does apply, doesn't it? Well, that was pretty depressing. Let's have Mr. Gaffigan give us another laugh.
Clams and oysters? How did we even start eating those? Hey, I found a rock with a snot in it. Thinking of eating it. Go ahead. All right. What's it taste like? Pneumonia! Oysters on the half shell as opposed to what? In a Kleenex? Even the way you're supposed to eat an oyster, squeeze some lemon, a little hot sauce, throw it down the back of your throat, take a shot of vodka, and try and forget eat a snack marat. That's not how you eat something. That's how you overdose on sleeping pills. Pearls come from oysters. Yeah, I try not to eat things that also make jewelry. Oysters are an aphrodisiac? Why would we ever believe that? What do you say, you and I grab some snots from Iraq? See what happens. Maybe we'll end up at my place. Maybe we'll end up at the emergency room.
Okay, how about another oyster story from the Huffington Post? Vibriosis, deadly disease associated with raw oysters, may get more common as ocean warms. 40-year-old Daryl Deshawn was not an oyster fan. Before June of 2009, he had never even tried one. So when his wife Nicole proposed splitting a dozen of the raw shellfish at a restaurant in Panama City, Florida, where the two were vacationing, he was leery. Nicole remembered eating 10. She says Daryl ate 2. A day later, Deshawn, a quality inspector at a heavy machinery plant outside Cincinnati, started vomiting and getting diarrhea. He got worse over the next few hours. Nicole urged him to go to the hospital. After confirming that Deshawn had eaten raw oysters and conducting lab tests, the doctors delivered the awful news that he had contracted a form of vibriosis, one of the most deadly foodborne illnesses in the world. Over the following weeks, Daryl's health continued to decline. He developed life-threatening septicemia. His doctors amputated both his legs above the knee in an effort to stop the spread of the bacteria. The amputation helped. By the end of August, Daryl's health had improved enough for him to be transferred from Florida to another hospital in Alabama. He stayed there a month, then went back home to Ohio, where he started physical therapy and rehab to adjust to life in a wheelchair. But just 4 months later, Deshawn's legs became infected again. His kidneys and liver started to fail. Facing a lifetime of dialysis, he and Nicole decided not to pursue further treatment. He was just tired of being in the hospital and being in pain, Nicole Deshawn told the Huffington Post. We just made the decision to be at home and give him hospice care. The article goes on to say that the cases of vibriosis are becoming more common in the United States. The article states that it was believed that the disease is primarily found in warm waters, but that scientists are rethinking this as, quote, the disease has already cropped up in places it had never been seen before: Israel, the Baltic Sea, and Alaska. The article states that vibriosis is uncommon, but also goes on to say, yet when it strikes hard. It kills about half the people who get it, a rate comparable among foodborne illnesses only to the dreaded Listeria monocytogenes, and many of these deaths are usually painful. It's a pretty gruesome way to die. It's about as bad as it gets, said personal injury lawyer Elliot Olson, who counts Deshawn among several other clients who have approached him about vibriosis. He described Deshawn's death as the most brutal he's seen in many years litigating on behalf of foodborne illness victims. So here's a question. Do you think Daryl Deshawn would have benefited from a life of obedience to Yahweh's commandments, particularly to the commandments in Leviticus 11? Here you have a real-life example of how disobedience brings death, and to obey is life and blessing. Here you can see that his commandments really were given. Do you think that as Daryl lay there dying in such a sad and gruesome way that he thought to himself, 2 oysters, not worth dying over? This story breaks my heart, but it didn't have to happen. No, not everyone who eats oysters will die like Daryl. But not everyone who smokes will get cancer either. But guess what? My dad smoked, and he died at age 63 of a massive and unexpected heart attack. My dad wasn't overweight. He was in otherwise good health, no cancer in his body. But the cigarettes still killed him. So not everyone who eats these toxic creatures will die like Daryl Deshawn, just like not everyone who smokes will die like my father. But nobody would argue with the fact that smoking kills, and so does eating things Yahweh commanded us not to eat. So let's continue looking at the evidence, shall we? From Boston, May 11, 2012. Shellfish wholesalers are being warned to take precautions against a bacteria found on oysters that can make people severely ill. Last summer and fall, 5 people in Massachusetts were badly sickened, and one almost died after eating raw oysters contaminated with bacteria known as Vibrio parahemolyticus, according to the Cape Cod Times.
But the Northeast, it's all shellfish. Maryland with the crab. Isn't it kind of a red flag you need a hammer to eat a crab? Oh, you're having the crab? Let me get you some tools. So you can crack open that bug shell and get that half a bite of bug meat. Crab, it's too much work. They're like the pistachio of seafood. And there's that nasty part of the crab you're not supposed to eat. I think it's called all of it. Because they're crabs, as in the sexually transmitted disease. That has the same name because it's the exact same thing. They're just the baby version of the dinner crab. You know, God's up in heaven going, what do I gotta do to stop them from eating the crabs? I gave it a rock hard shell. I put it on the bottom of the ocean. I named a disease after it. Jesus, you're gonna have to go back down there.
Crabs, anyone? Here's a nice picture of a giant crab doing what a crab does. He knows his dinner is in a trash can. Dinner, anyone? Allow me to introduce to you Bathnomus giganteus. Isn't he adorable? Just like crab or lobster, Bathnomus giganteus is the big brother to the shrimp. This beautiful creature also crawls along the seafloor eating dead, decaying whale carcasses. Doesn't he look tasty? A little cocktail sauce? Okay, this might take a lot of cocktail sauce. How about a side view of our friend Bathnomus giganteus? Does the design of this creature look familiar? It should. You've probably seen it before. How about another view? What you're looking at here is the, quote, land cousin of the crab, of the lobster, of the shrimp, and of course of Bathnomus giganteus. This is a cockroach. And one more look at the big brother of the shrimp. Yes, as I stated before, these two creatures don't look similar by accident. They are biological cousins, and they perform the same function. One does it on land, the other does it under the sea. But they do exactly the same job. You are what you eat, right? The cockroach of the sea. Yum. Do you know that if you eat shrimp, you're eating feces as well? That's right. If you eat shrimp, you too are a poop eater. Ever notice the long black strand along the shrimp's back? You know what that is? That dark colored tube is the intestinal tract of the shrimp, and it harbors poisonous bacteria. And again, people actually eat this bacteria-laden poop, literally. Food specialists who are just as ignorant as the average American citizen will tell you that it's okay to eat the black strand on the shrimp if the shrimp is cooked. This is along the lines of the same nonsense that if you cook pork really well, you can kill the trichinosis worms in the pork, which you will see is categorically false. But even if you could be sure and have cooked to death all the worms in your pork chop, who in their right mind wants to eat cooked worms? They're parasites. If you eat shrimp that is gritty, it's because the intestinal tube remained. Okay, enough picking on the poor shrimp. He's just trying to do his job. The reason lobsters, crawfish, and crab are cooked, quote, live is due to the bacteria problem, which occurs immediately upon their death. As I'm sure you know, lobsters turn red when they're boiled. This is due to the chitin that they possess. Chitin contains a bright red pigment called astaxanthin. Astaxanthin is bonded to several proteins, and while the chitin bonded, it remains brownish red in color. However, when the protein is heated by the boiling water, the bonds are broken, and when this happens, the astaxanthin is released. Oh, and by the way, it isn't just shrimp, crabs, and lobsters that contain the chitin molecule. Cockroaches also contain the same chitin in their shells, more proof that shellfish and cockroaches are indeed cousins. Yummy catfish. The number one grown or manufactured seafood product is catfish. No state in the United States produces as much catfish as the state of Mississippi. With Mississippi leading the way, the United States produces more than 450 million pounds of catfish. Does this really look like food? Catfish is also a scavenger. Catfish hold high levels of mercury and other toxins in their flesh. Without fail, the animals Yahweh designated as unclean all have the same thing in common. They're all cleaners of the rivers, of the lakes, and of the sea. Some filter the water like clams and oysters and mussels. Others clean up the refuse from the bottom like shrimp, lobsters, crawfish, and crabs. Both sharks and catfish lack two requirements. They don't have fins and scales. Now, they both have fins, but no scales. And both are swimming vacuum cleaners, eating anything and everything in their path. I remember as a kid making my own catfish bait. I never ate the catfish, but they fight really hard and they're a lot of fun to catch. We'd buy chicken livers and we'd leave them out to get putrid and stinky. There was nothing better for catching these unclean beasts than rotted chicken livers. Catfish are loaded with bacteria and other toxins.